Welcome to Sheffield and to Sheffield Cathedral.
Thank you.
Karen, you're the author of a great many best-selling books. I want to focus on two of them. This one, which is probably your most famous book, A History of God, and a more recent one called The Case for God. And then when we've talked about those two books, I want to talk a little bit about your upcoming book, Sacred Nature. Now, before we turn to your publications, let's talk a little bit about your biography, because I think it's relevant for an understanding of your books. I know this is a long time ago, but for several years you were a Roman Catholic nun, and then you abandoned that calling, if indeed it was a calling. Why did you want to become a nun, and why did you then decide not to continue with that?
Well, I thought that when I became a nun, I would become serene, holy, wise, and would somehow transcend all the struggles of adolescence, all the fears, the anxieties. And I was a sincere believer at that time. And of course, it was being a nun, joining a religious order, was the best thing you can do. And I never thought I would get married. And I was right about that. I never have been married. But I thought that this would be a fulfilled life. But I was very young, far too young, I think, to make that kind of decision. I was 17 years old, and far more immature, I think, or worldly wise, less worldly wise than a teenager would be today in the late 50s and 60s.
And trying to become a nun, how did that go? What was your experience?
Well, it was hard going, but I knew it would be hard going because you had to die to yourself. And that meant you had to become another person and let all those complications and meannesses one has and fears and yearnings, put it to one side. And I thought I would become serene, as I say, and fulfilled. But I couldn't see myself ever fitting into the world. I was very, very shy. And teenagers those days were much shyer and more introverted and protected than they are today. I was not popular at school. And I thought I would never really make friends, and so I would become holy instead, and unfortunately that didn't happen.
Yeah, so one of the ideas was to sort of be at peace with yourself, and that didn't come to pass.
Well, no, it's hard going in there, and I was also had the misfortune of getting the training in the novitiate was on its way out. Mm-hmm. I entered at the same time as the Vatican Council was convened in Rome in 1962. And that completely turned the Catholic Church upside down and inside out. It needed it. It badly needed reform. And one of the things that needed reform was the education of young religious like me. So I went through I had the old system, which had been in place since the Victorian period, at its last gasp. And it was, as I was making my vows, it was beginning to phase out. And there were younger people, people coming in after me who were much older and just wouldn't take the kind of treatment that we had. And so things were definitely on the move.
So is it fair to say that it was a very difficult experience for you?
Yes. But it was meant to be difficult because it's not meant to be just a lovely, fulfilling time, singing hymns and that kind of thing. You're meant to die to yourself and put that self to one side and get rid of all the worldly things. Not that I'd had much chance of being in the world, but get rid of those selfishness, desire. And I cried most of my time all the way through. We were continually being told off and excoriated for the smallest possible things. And this was to make us humble and to realize that we had so far to go before we became good nuns, if we ever did. And so I was very nervous. I was very nervous. I'd noticed when the year after me, where they were much more mature, older and more sure of themselves, they wouldn't take this. whereas I was just timid and frightened.
Yes, and then you read English at Oxford. At first, I think this was still part of your education as a nun. Were you happier as a student of English?
Oh well, Oxford is a place that's not without its own difficulties. And being a nun at Oxford, I didn't really spend much time with the students, but I did very well scholastically. And this slightly bewildered my religious order, because I came from, I found that a lot of them were very, very class-ridden, very snobbish. I came from, my father was a scrap metal merchant, not only a scrap metal merchant, one that went bankrupt. I had no good pedigree, and they didn't like it that I was doing rather better than some of the more aristocratic young nuns, and so that was difficult. But as I was being encouraged to think for myself by my tutors, I started to question a lot of the things that were going on. But it was a strain, and that first year I felt I was being pulled apart in two directions. I was terrified at the idea of leaving the religious life, terrified. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking, and thinking for myself and being more critical. And eventually, at the end of that year, the first year at Oxford, I had a breakdown. And by the following Christmas, I decided to leave. I had to apply to Rome for a dispensation from my vows, and had to wait till that dispensation came through from the Pope.
But you continued reading English.
Yes, I did. I continued and did well.
Yeah. Did you then lose your faith? Was that a slow process? Or?
It was slow. My faith had always been a bit flimsy, struggling. Did I really believe this? Even in the convent, it seemed.
Yes.
And I also was living in the house of atheistic dons. I looked after Professor Herbert Hart, who was head professor of jurisprudence in Oxford University.
Yeah, very famous professor.
Very famous. And his wife Jennifer, who was a history don at my college. And they had a child who had been brain damaged at birth. And I had a free room in their house in return for looking after Jacob a couple of nights a week. Well, this utter atheistic household was extraordinary. And I remember we used to go down to their house, their summer house in Cornwall, and I'd have to walk miles to get to Mass on Sundays. And eventually I decided that I wasn't going to do this. And someone said, one of the guests said, I'll run you down. Oh, for God's sake, don't do that, Sir Jennifer. She's just beginning to get out of all that stuff. So it was difficult, but they were great to me, actually, because I was having serious breakdowns.
Yeah.
I was still finding it very difficult to make it in the world. I was suicidal at one point, taken to hospital in the middle of the night, and still they kept me back.
And they gave you something of a home.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not in any sentimental way, but just they were absolutely there for me, and I'll never forget that kindness.
And then you graduated, you did really well, got a congratulatory first, and I think then you embarked on a postgraduate degree.
Yes, and that seemed to go all right, but then I failed. And it's very difficult to fail a doctorate at Oxford. But the examiner, who was a very well-known English literature professor, said that I wrote 4 lines in his report and said I was a very clever young woman, but in his view this was not a proper topic for a PhD.
It was about Tennyson, wasn't it?
Tennyson's poetic style.
Yeah, but it was the topic that you had been given.
Yes.
So did you not, I'm not recommending this, obviously under any circumstances, but did you not have the desire to, go to the external and, say this is absolutely unacceptable?
I was far too timid still. I was still far too broken and timid and coming round, and this gives another blow to my confidence. But also, I was told by my tutor, who was absolutely enraged, that that half the body of governors who made this decision were dead against it.
Yes.
There'd been a big row about it, so they'd rowed about this and argued about it for 6 whole months before Dame Helen Gardiner herself said she was sorry for me, but the sanctity of the Oxford doctorate was more important. But I'm really glad that I failed.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, so you couldn't become a nun, and then you couldn't become an academic, but then afterwards you did have this brilliant career. So I don't want to say all's well that ends well, because they were obviously still very difficult experiences. But you then did get into a profession that seems to have suited you really well.
Well, yes, but it wasn't done after I was finished at Oxford. I then went in for school teaching, but I had ill health. Yes. I have a form of epilepsy, which they still weren't treating properly, and was having a lot of time off. And so after 6 years of that, I was asked to resign again. And I was wondering, what on earth, every 6 years my life seemed to crumble.
What's going to become of me?
Yes, what will happen? But I had written my first book by this time. It was my rather angry book about my time as a nun. I was seen by Channel 4 television, which was just starting up. They liked that. They did an interview, they liked that. And I got a job in Israel to do a 6-part documentary as a presenter on St. Paul with an Israeli film company. Now, this was riotous in many ways. The Israelis were extremely blunt and rude and frank, as they always are, but we became very friendly. They thought at first I was just a boring school teacher, but then they decided I was okay. And this turned out to be a success. I was still very angry about religion, but I did come to like St. Paul very much, because I had the Reverend Michael Goulder, not so long ago deceased, who was a great New Testament scholar, and he'd been put to my advisor, and he'd been very chary with me at first, but then at the end he was happy to put his name on the list, the cast list, and he liked it, and we became good friends after that. So that was wonderful, and I learnt there too quite a lot about Islam. I learnt about Middle Eastern politics, and it was a great eye-opener for me. But then my television career collapsed, because I did another documentary with this same film company, but this time they embezzled all the money. And Channel 4 was furious, and I got sort of sacked as a result.
And you didn't get any money either, presumably?
No. And so there I was, out on my own, out on a limb, and trying to struggle along and I was well into my 30s by this time, struggle along writing the odd review and writing some more of these angry books about religion. And then something changed. I had a new supervisor, a new literary agent, rather, who was not particularly religious, but she was starting up her own agency, and she was wonderful. And somehow, what brushed off on me, she never sat me down and said, now look here, about these books of yours, I think you can do better than this. Her own standard of excellence rubbed off on me in some way, and I began to see that I had to do something different. And then I think the whole of my life turned around considerably. I wrote a book called A History of God, which I suspected would, at the beginning, would take the skeptical line of its predecessors.
Yes.
But I found that I was absolutely moved by the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, especially the Greek Orthodox Christian theology, and was beginning to see my way through to not being religious in the old way, but religious in a different way.
Yeah. Before we come on to that book, is that sort of the path by which you then climbed your way back to religion, as it were?
Yes, by study. By the study of the research I was doing for these new books. And it came about with the history of God, which turned out quite differently. When I looked into the intricacies and the way that people had in different faiths sort of thought about the divine, I realized what a limited idea of God I'd had before. And so that was enthralling. But also, during that time, I discovered a footnote in a book, a learned book about history of Islam, and it was quoting the great Islamist Louis Massignon, who said that the historian of religion must learn to cultivate what he called the science of compassion. That is a form of knowledge that came by compassion. That didn't mean feeling sorry for people or sympathizing with them. It meant feeling with them, compathein. And so that he said, when you are reading an account of a religious idea that sounds quite alien to you, keep asking yourself, but why? But why? And never leave it, he said, until you can see that in those circumstances in which he or she was living, you would have felt the same. In that way, he said, you will lay aside the self and develop what he called the science of compassion, a form of knowledge that came by feeling with others, by putting yourself in other people's shoes instead of endlessly spouting out your own feelings. And that completely changed the way I both approached the work and the way I saw religion.
Okay, let's look at the argument in A History of God and the case for God in a bit more detail. The overarching argument of these two books, it seems to me, is that our perception of God has undergone something of a paradigm shift, a sea change over the centuries. And you distinguish there between two different periods. One period going from, say, 30,000 BC to roughly the end of the Middle Ages, and then roughly from the end of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, until the present day. And the way people viewed God in the first period, the God they had is what you call the unknown God. And perhaps the best way in is to look at, the best way into that is by looking at the distinction between mythos and logos. Can you say a little bit about that distinction?
Yes, I'd like to say first, however, that that change that you saw is more clear in Western Christianity than it is in either Judaism or Islam. Rabbinic Judaism and Kabbalah, all the are very profound, but after you get in the West, rather than in the Greek Orthodox Church, you get a much more rationalistic view of God as we progress into the scientific world and lose a lot of the sense of mythos. Myth has been defined as something that in some sense happened once, but which also happens all the time.
Yes.
It's expressing an eternal truth, not a historical one. And it is also intuitive rather than logical.
Yes.
Whereas the West was becoming more and more logical as we progressed scientifically, and that's been the source of our greatness and in the world. But also, we've lost a sense of spirituality in it. It's entirely different from Greek Orthodox Christianity, which has also been more profound, more mystical, and less logos-driven.
So if we stick with Christianity, then before the second period, so from again 30,000 BC till the end of the Middle Ages, and obviously this is a generalization, right? One has to generalize across these very big periods. Then you have mythos and logos. Logos, something like, gives us empirical, scientific truth.
We need both.
And mythos gives us a kind of experiential truth, so a kind of insight that allows us to, an experience that allows us to live more intensely, more creatively,
more deeply,
to come to terms with our imperfections and mortality as well.
Yes, and our struggles. It's more about the intuitive part of ourselves, rather than the logical part of ourselves.
And the key thing about that first period, if I've understood you correctly, is that people realized that they needed both. They needed myth and they needed logos. So you have there are different ways of approaching the world that are equally valid, and they're complementary. So it's not myth or science, it's myth and science. And that then starts to change in the Renaissance. Is that a fair summary?
Roughly, yes. I would say it's starting in the Renaissance, and then it goes on to the Age of Reason. To the 18th century, 19th century, and then you have the rise of science, which has been the great triumph of the West. But when you try and apply, then there's all this fuss about how could God have created the world in 7 days, for example.
That then happens in that second period.
Yes.
If we now go back to that first period and look at religion as a form of myth, that takes us to the unknown God. So within this period, roughly speaking, how did people see God? What does it mean to talk about the unknown God?
Well, basically, we can never know God. And that's what the Enlightenment people failed to understand. Because what we call God is infinite and unknowable. The cloud of unknowing, for example, a great 14th century mystical text, says that, that our minds cannot contain God. And unfortunately, we've got that biblical image of God in Christianity, where he keeps behaving in a rather human way, appearing, chatting to people, choosing people, having favorites, and all the rest of it. Whereas the mystics are saying, yes, we can start with that. But as we go on, we realize that God is something that we will never be able to grasp logically. As we became more scientific in the West, especially in places like Europe and England, the myths of Scripture became impossible for many people to understand. A myth is something that in some sense happened once, but which also happens all the time. It's not meant to be logical. And constantly, the great world religions have insisted that we cannot say what God is. Now, we in the West have never been very good at this. I mean, as a child, I was led the catechism answer to the question, what is God? And in a single sentence, I had to say, God is the Supreme Spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. Now, I have to say that at the age of 8, that didn't mean much to me. But I also think it's incorrect. Because the whole idea of saying that you can say in a single sentence what God is defies the whole, not only the Christian, but Islamic, Judaic traditions too. God is unknowable.
Yeah, so if you accept that religious speaking is a form of mythical speaking,
yes,
then you realize,
or poetic speaking.
Yeah, then you realize that God has to put it in philosophical terms, a different ontological status from ordinary objects. So I can say this is a finger, or I can say you are here now, but I cannot point to God in the same way. God is not that kind of object. So Bertrand Russell has his famous essay where he talks about, maybe God is, let's compare God to a celestial teapot. But of course that is precisely the wrong starting point, because that is not the kind of entity that God is. So the way people let's stick with Christianity for the time being, talked about God, even in the Middle Ages, was still very often through what is called apophatic theology. What is apophatic theology?
It means we don't know what we're talking about. That when we say and we fall into silence, and that when we say what God is, we have to stop talking. And it is a sort of a moment of uplift. Now, we in the West have tended to sort of pin God down to being a creator. Then the book of Genesis doesn't help if you're going to translate this literally. The Greek Orthodox don't have this problem. They had their own very strong mythical tradition and were able to adapt that to much more, as they say, apophatic way of speech, which it means that you fall into silence. Yeah. When you start talking about what God is, you realize that you're speaking nonsense.
Yeah. So it's really a kind of, sometimes it's also called negative theology, I think, so that people recognize we can't say God is created, but we can also not say God is not created, because he is in a sense, not in a sense, because he is beyond words. So our job, as it were, is then to, because we have this intuitive, tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm understanding you wrongly, but we have this kind of sense, this intuitive sense of God, and then of a something, we have an experience, an intuition, and we then try and talk about it, but then at the same time we realize that everything we do, we fall short of that experience, that intuition. And it is maybe precisely because we fall short of it that we realize this is really God. If God were different, if God were the way Bertrand Russell wanted him to be, or Richard Dawkins wants him to be, then he would be a kind of alien, a kind of super alien. But he is precisely not that. Is that a good way of looking at it?
It is, up to a point, because it's not just a question of thinking. Right. It's a question of doing, behaving, and sort of art too, ritual. Now, we've got rid of a lot of ritual in certain parts of Christianity, and that's been a loss, so we're relying on words. You go to a Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox service, and the music touches you. I mean, it's extraordinary, the sound, and it lifts you because it's dealing with the intuition, and it's going beyond words.
And it becomes kind of a motivating force to locate yourself differently in the world and act in a different way. Is that right?
You must do that, but you must realize that when we talk about God, we don't know what we're talking about. There must always be that sense of the apophatic. That's difficult for us because of our scriptures, where God is such a sort of personality and endlessly holding down the law for us. It's something like the Quran, for example. It's impossible for us really to read the Quran because we read it in translation. But when it is sung, it reduces people to tears. And it's that aesthetic sense that gets us an intuition of what God is, rather than just a sense of logic. I remember in Palestine one night, I was careering around the West Bank with a bunch of young Palestinian men. And they were not devout people. They were all drinking beer for a start, so that, they clearly weren't good Muslims. But suddenly the Quran came on the car radio. And these boys were transfixed, their eyes filled with tears. They then started trying to tell me what the Quran was saying. It means this and this, but it doesn't mean that. It also means that and that, because the Quran the language is so rich, plus the chant. And it's that aesthetic sense, not just a logical sense, that takes us beyond ourselves, beyond our reason, and gives us intimations of something that lies beyond what we can talk about.
Yeah. So the theologian Nicholas of Cusa has got this wonderful phrase, docta ignorantia. Yes. In other words, the knowing ignorance. So we know that all our knowledge of God is ultimately only pseudo-knowledge. And yet we have this tendency, as you say, especially in the West, to pin down, for example, the Bible on a set of clear messages or a set of clear moral precepts. Now, the interesting thing is, and maybe you can talk about this for a little bit, because we also have a tendency to think of the Bible just as a unity, kind of like the Old Testament. But of course, there were both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament a whole range of different authors. Can you talk? People sometimes talk about J and E when it comes to the Old Testament. So, what are J and E?
They're two different traditions. One in the south of Israel, one in the north. J is called J because they call it Yahweh, because they like talking about God as Yahweh. And E is rather more logical, and they call God Elohim, E. And they're just two different traditions. There's also P, just to complicate things, which is the priestly tradition.
Yeah.
And then there's D, the Deuteronomists' tradition. And all this is good up to a point. And it helps us to analyze the Bible, and we can see exactly where this came from. This came from the south, this came from the north. But I think the important thing is that the people who edited the Bible just put it all together, so that things didn't make all perfect sense or follow a certain logical thing. And if you start reading the Bible from one page to another, it's very difficult to know what God is, because it's a contradictory thing. And that, again, should bring us to a sense of apophasis, a sense of silence, that we don't. But unfortunately, we in the West, with our nice logical scientific minds, are not really comfortable with that. And we're sitting down reading the Bible in this way was not something that people did. It was sung. It was part of the liturgy, and with all that lovely Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox music, and so it takes you out of the logical. Beyond saying who did what when, and making you realize that we're in the presence of something that can't be spoken about.
The other good thing, though, about knowing who did what when and who wrote what when is that you realize that there isn't just one voice. Right. To use the term of the cultural theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, you have a polyphony of voices. You have different voices, and that means different perceptions of God, different experiences of God. So the Bible already itself is telling us, you can't pin this down. This is God. Here He is, and so on. And yet we, as you say, we kind of resist that because that contradicts our scientific, rationalistic mind.
And the New Testament is just the same.
Yes.
4 completely different looks at what Jesus was, and then you've got Paul coming in, and the redactors are not worried about putting things side by side, so that you have 2 completely different birth stories of the story of Jesus' birth, one in Matthew, one in Luke. They're saying different things. Matthew is saying Jesus has come for the whole world, so he has the Magi come from Iran to worship at the crib. Luke is saying, no, he's come for the poor, and he has the shepherds coming. We've just bungled them all together, so you see in the great masters a rather clean-looking stable with kings and shepherds alongside each other. But they're both saying different things. And John is saying something completely different again.
Yeah. But that polyphony or polyvalence, to use another posh term, that is something that gets lost in this second phase of Christianity from roughly the Renaissance onward. Is that right? Where myth then becomes reduced to logos, where the church itself then starts to rely on logos and identifies with science. But then the problem with that, of course, is that the moment you transform myth into logos, that you transform religion into a form of logos, then it's got to conform to the criteria of logos. And then that doesn't work.
It doesn't work any more than when you read a poem and then apply the rules of logic to it. The poem won't work. The scriptures are works of art, and we've taken them as sort of factual, and they don't work.
What kind of vision or perception or view of God does that produce when you have this, when you reduce religion to logos, what kind of God do we then end up with?
Well, the God of the Enlightenment. We have a God that creates the world, Newton, for example. And he has a God, when he's asked what God is like, he said God is clearly very well versed in mathematics and geometry, as though he's just made a God in his own image and likeness, Newton has. But very many people today still think of God in the way that Newton has described it. Yeah. And many people say, well, I can't believe that God created the world and scientifically. And of course, that's not what the book of Genesis is saying at all. Yeah.
So if you interpret God in that way, if you try and make him into a scientific God, that ultimately then leads to atheism, because then people will say, well, that kind of God doesn't exist, or where is he? Where can I find him? Or he can't have created the world in 6 days and so on, because we know that, it took a much longer period.
It also means that we have to behave differently. It's not just a question of reading the scriptures or just making intellectual decisions. Our behavior also makes us respond differently. And that means we have to, in our behavior, we have to practice kenosis. That means self-emptying, putting ourselves to one side, loving others more than ourselves, turning the other cheek when attacked, and without that kind of generosity and charity, religion is nothing.
Yeah. When you look at religion as not a form of myth, but as a form of logos, then you have a kind of scientific view of religion, which, for example, wants to locate God in place and time, which wants to read the Bible literally as if it were some sort of biology manual, which wants to then say, okay, so how did the earth come to be? Well, because it was created by God, and then you give the story in Genesis, and then you reject evolution, and you replace that with creationism or intelligent design. So then, if you have that sort of scientific understanding of religion, ultimately you end up with fundamentalism. And it seems to me that that what you're saying is, yes, that happens, but then there's also kind of a reaction to that, a counter-reaction, which then attacks that form of religious fundamentalism, but which itself turns out to be a form of secular fundamentalism. Have I understood you correctly there?
I think that the point about religion is to stop thinking that you know it all, to stop thinking that you're right and other people are wrong. Nobody is right about religion. None of us know what God is, or what nirvana is. And we will not be able, and all the religions say that unless we behave differently, what we think is rubbish. What the Gospels are telling us is to give all you have to the poor, to honor everybody that you meet, to be prepared to suffer for your beliefs, and just charity is the word for it. And that means not just when you feel like it, but all day and every day. So that all day and every day you put yourself to one side and reach, and once as the self goes down, the God becomes greater. Once we are enmeshed in arguments, we are concerned about ourselves and our own cleverness and our own thinking and our own brilliance, and then we are stuck in ego. The religions are meant to work on us aesthetically, so that we feel, as you do when you listen to great music, you feel enlarged within yourself. The world appears to be a beautiful place. And religion says that you must then go outside and make the world a beautiful place by good action. But unless you're behaving in a different way, all these ideas about God are nothing. And the quarrels about creation and everything are all about ego. People having their own arguments and hearing, this is what I think and how brilliant I am. instead of saying the world is an extraordinary mystery.
Yeah. So it's really an unwillingness or an inability to accept a plurality of experience. Is that right?
Yes, and to lay yourselves aside. Because, we are taught, aren't we, to express ourselves and, argue things well and show how clever you are. That has to go. Yeah. And instead you have what they call kenosis, which is in Greek it means emptying. Yeah, yeah. Emptying yourself of ego and giving to others. The Quran, for example, has just really one message: give what you have to others and make sure there's no one hungry in your life. And do that. We have to act too, as well as just think. Otherwise, religion is barren.
Yeah. Let's talk about Richard Dawkins for a moment, because people always bring him up as the great critic of religion, even though the critiques of the 19th century were arguably more powerful than the critique put forward by Dawkins. You strongly disagree with Dawkins' arguments. Can you say a little bit about why? I mean, it's implicit in what you've said, but can you try and make it explicit?
I think what I most dislike about him, about his writing, is its ego. It's all about him. Mm. There's an anger and a spite and a disdain in it, and that is the antithesis of what religion should be, though it often fails to be like that.
So in that sense, it's similar. That's what I was trying to get at. In that sense, it's similar to religious fundamentalism, because they think they are in the sole possession of the truth.
Yes, yeah. And once you say that, you've lost the plot. Yeah. None of us know anything. Yeah. The cloud of unknowing, for example, that mystical text, we know nothing about God. Yeah. Yeah. And it has to be brought down to the sense that we are in that the life is a mystery. Life is full of sorrow. Life is full of pain, and yet somehow if we behave in a different way, and that means all of them insist on kindness. Tonight I'm going to be finishing off with there's a Buddhist prayer which says, let all beings be happy, whether there's high or low estate, alive or still to be born, may they all be perfectly happy, and let your loving thoughts spread out to the world. We should be sending look at the world at the moment today, with what's happening in the Ukraine, what's happening also in Russia, the horror, the way the Iranians have been behaving, but the way we've treated the Iranians too. The pain we've inflicted on one another, and therefore the anger and despair. This is what is stopping us understanding religion. When we go in for these, if we're not worried about the pain of others, if we're not trying to assuage the pain of others and doing whatever we can to assuage it, whatever we may think about God is neither here nor there.
Yeah. I think that's a great transition to, because you mentioned your lecture that you'll be giving this evening, to your upcoming book, Sacred Nature. Yes. Can you say a little bit about that book? I know it hasn't been published yet, but you will be talking about it this evening.
I will.
So tell us about Sacred Nature.
Sacred Nature. I thought something should be said about religion and the environment. And my publishers said, do a short one this time, and it's a sort of change your mind look.
Has it become a short one?
It's much shorter than usual, yes. But we can all argue about the environment. We've got to change the way we behave. We've got to stop, using our cars. We've got to stop flying around so much. And the way we've got to, and we're not up to that at the moment. We're all shooting back after the pandemic into our cars and planes and things. This can't be. but it's no good just... The trouble is that we in the West have scientifically changed the view of nature. We think about it in terms of science, and that's been very wonderful in many ways, science and medicine and all that. But we've lost that sense of reverence for nature. And we are not going to change the planet, or save the planet, unless we change the way we think and the way we speak. Not just about cutting down on petrol and that kind of thing.
Is this why you used the title Sacred Nature?
Nature is sacred, and we've lost that sense of sacrality of nature in all the world religions, and including the Greek Orthodox. Nature is permeated with the divine. In India, there is no single God. The highest value is a force called Dri, and it permeates the whole of humanity, the whole of nature. Every plant, every tree is an expression of the divine. And it's expressed in terms of myth, and therefore it's respected and loved. Whereas we've treated it as a commodity, as something that we can just use, and we've wrecked it. This is in China, India, as I say, certainly in the Quran. The Quran has a much stronger view of nature than the Bible. The Bible has very little time for nature. The Bible is more about the God being present in history, in events like the Exodus or the coming of Jesus. In the world religions, God is what we call God, the sacred, whether we call it Ki or Brahman. It's imbued in the natural world. It's in every flower or tree, every wind. And it therefore has, and it's personified, it's done poetically, and people respond to it and honor it. And we talk about the golden rule. Yes. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. The Chinese said this also applies to nature. Do not do to others, do not do to nature what you would not have done to yourself. We are encouraged to sort of fill our heart, approach it emotionally, but with not just in a sloppy way where you wander lonely as a cloud, but you use your brain in a different way.
Are you optimistic about that?
No, I'm not, but we have to do...
I'm asking, as a Calvinist and having a strong sense of man's, to use that old-fashioned expression, man's sinfulness, and as you say, you look around you and you look at see all the terrible things that are happening.
Yes.
Can we be optimistic?
No, but I don't think we should be pessimistic either, because then you give up. I think there has to be that sense. We've got to start looking at nature. We don't look at things anymore. We just take photographs of them. People photograph everything these days. I was in a restaurant in Singapore, and a couple at my next table ordered hamburgers, and they both solemnly took photographs of the hamburgers before they ate them.
Yeah. Seeing beautiful parts of the world is no longer seems to generate a sense of awe, no. But it's so that you can take a selfie and then send it via yes. Instagram or whatever to other people. So you have had, Max Weber already talked about this at the early 20th century, a disenchantment of the world, yes. Ever since the Enlightenment at the latest.
Yes, and that's been in the West chiefly, but we spread that ethos throughout the world. But unless we start thinking of nature as something that we revere and honor and admire and that almost worship, that we see the sacred in it, we're not going to save the planet. We're just going to go on using it, abusing it. And so I've taken various points that we can do. First of all, learning about the way other people have seen nature and still see it. Very few people in the non-Western world really understand our Western view of nature. They still have many of the old poetic ways of looking at it. When I speak in Pakistan, sometimes I quote Wordsworth, and I'll be quoting Wordsworth tonight, when he looks at nature, and he's looking at it as the religious people do, but he's doing it in a new secular way. He said, I've learned to look at nature differently. And to hear the sweet, sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply understood, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the minds of man. A motion and a spirit that informs all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. And notice that he says he's learnt he's worked to create that. It's not just something that's dropped upon him. He's carefully cultivated this. And notice when he says something far more deeply infused, he uses words very carefully. Yes. We use the word something very loosely. What shall we have for supper? Oh, I don't know, eggs or something. No, he is saying something. He won't say God, because our view of God stuck in the heavens is not what he's talking about. He's looking for the immanent God that is in every flower, every tree, which is what has been cultivated for centuries in all the other world religions.
And which you're saying is what we must try and find again.
We must somehow try and recreate that attitude in ourselves. And I've tried to show little things that we can do. Even just spending a little time looking at nature. Instead of dashing from hither to yon, but just sitting and listening to the birds, looking at the trees, just for 10 minutes a day.
I think that's a very good note to end this interview on as well.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you.